Hi, and welcome to Lurie Children's Facebook Live. I'm Julianne Bardaly, one of your hosts for this evening's discussion. October 18th to the 24th is recognized as National Teen Driver Safety Week. Tonight, we will have a conversation about teen driver safety, an especially important topic for anyone with a newly licensed teen or a teen who is learning to drive. This Facebook Live is brought to you through the collaborative efforts of the Teamwork to Reduce Infant, Child, and Adolescent Mortality Program, the Injury Prevention Research Center, and the Tiny Cargo Big Deal Research Team at Lurie Children's. I'd also like to take a moment to introduce our panel tonight. We have our moderator, emergency medicine physician at Lurie Children's, Dr. Michelle Macy, Jessica Choi, a child passenger safety instructor at Lurie Children's, and our team participants, Annika and Hunter. And I'd like to thank you guys for joining us tonight for this topic and discussion. And at that, I'd like to hand things over to Dr. Macy.
Thanks, Julianne, and thanks to everybody who's joining us tonight to be part of this important discussion. To get things started off, I wanted us to hear a little bit about how things went when Annika and Hunter were first learning to drive. And I'm wondering, Hunter, if you could just start us out telling a little bit about how you went about learning to drive and some of your early experiences driving.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, my mom was always just very, proactive about, teaching me the rules of the road whenever I was in the car. Even like my little brother, she tells him things to hope that, they like stick with him and he knows the right things to do and the wrong things to do while driving. But I actually started driving in like the country by my dad's house, like central Illinois, and there's not really a lot of heavy traffic out there, so it's pretty easy to learn on less populated roads and stuff. And I think I started a little before I had my permit, maybe like 13 or something, which I don't think my mom knew about, and I'm sure she wasn't happy with, but I think just that exposure really helps. Yeah.
Yeah, I had a similar experience starting out. So I learned in northern Michigan, I think like the summer before I turned 15. And so I practiced a couple times, like driving through farms and stuff. And then once I turned 15, I started a driver's training course. And so I like took classes in a classroom and they sort of had us practice for the permit tests, and they told us like we had an instructor that went with us on drives and like corrected like mistakes that we made and gave us recommendations for things like to watch out for on our tests. And I think overall this was a super like helpful way for me to feel less stressed about my test because I felt like I knew what was going to happen going into it. And I also think that it's a good way for your teen to start like learning good driving habits from someone who has been teaching kids how to drive. But also it's not possible for everyone to have a course like this, and learning like Hunter did is good too.
And Annika, I wanted to pull on that a little bit and hear some of the things that as a teen you feel being in the car with your parent and getting kind of some advice about what you're doing versus having an instructor with you. And what are some of the pluses and minuses to that?
Yeah, so I think as a teen, you sort of sometimes don't want to listen to everything that your parents say. And so having a separate person to sort of guide you through and someone who is able to like give you specific tips can be super helpful.
And Hunter, I don't remember, did you have a driver's training experience as well, or was it more learn on your own for you? And
Yeah, so I never had like actual courses or anything, or like an instructor, but I would agree with Annika about like having that third party is probably a good step for most people, because I'm sure it takes some of the like you're my parent bias out of it and really makes you more susceptible to actually, take in and learn and have fun when you're doing it.
Jess, I'm hoping to pick on you here for this next question. As somebody who is a safety professional, how do you balance that role of kind of parent giving advice against the expertise that you really have in this field? And what kinds of things do you choose to share with your kids as you're starting to give those safe driving lessons down the road?
This is a hard one because you are trying to not be too much of a parent and scream, "No, stop!" every time they do something that that scares you a little bit as they're learning, which is, I think, totally natural. But one thing that we talked about a lot is we certainly follow the law. We think that's very important. But for me, what's even more important than that, I don't want my kids just thinking about, if you do this, you'll get a ticket, because a ticket can be paid and eventually it usually falls off your record. But what I really want them thinking about is, for us, driving is such a huge, like, it's a life or death responsibility. And so I want to impart upon my kids that if you text and drive, I'm not worried about you getting a ticket. I'm worried about you taking your eyes off the road and hitting another car, causing a crash, hitting a pedestrian, hitting a bicyclist. There are so many things that can happen, and we can make mistakes and we can undo almost everything except hitting or, injuring or killing another person. So I really stress to my kids the importance of, we don't do these rolling stops. We come to a complete stop. We make sure, we even double make sure that there's no pedestrians, there are no kids running to chase their ball in front of the road. And it's things like that why we can't take our eyes off the road, even for that quick text. So I want them to realize, you answering that text is, that can be someone's life. And a lot of the families that we work with, for advocacy, for better, stronger safety laws, they have lost a family member, a loved one, to someone's moment of inattention, that of course no one thinks, oh, I'm going to send this text and kill someone. But unfortunately, that is how quickly it happens. So I really wanted to impart upon my kids how this is a life or death thing. So when you're behind that wheel, you are responsible for so many lives, drivers, pedestrians, bicyclists, everyone else on the road.
That's a great point, Jess. And I think, Dr. Macy, you've touched on this in conversations I've had with you. That split second that someone can take just looking away to send a short little text or a response, even a okay, can really distract the driver from the task at hand and have really big consequences, right?
Yeah, and even just looking down at a text for 5 seconds when you're traveling down the highway at 55 miles an hour, in that moment, you're traveling an entire football field length. So 5 seconds, you've gone 100 yards and you've been blind to what's gone on around you because you're focused on that phone. And I think another thing that Jess is kind of bringing up here, and I want to hear a little bit from Hunter and Annika about, is in addition to phones being distracting, there's also a lot of things going around you when you're driving. And both Hunter and Annika were talking about starting out driving in more country settings. And I'd like to hear you guys talk a little bit about what it's like kind of being in a more urban environment and driving in the city. What kinds of things are different for you in those situations? And maybe Hunter could go first.
Yeah, I think I'm looking at the comments here. I think someone said that learning to drive is a little more difficult for their teen in the city. So like I was saying, like so when I started, I was learning in the country and everything, but you know, I would always be driving like with my mom. Like I wouldn't be driving, but I'd be a passenger with my mom or with someone else in the city. And I think just the exposure to that really helps. Like just seeing how someone else navigates the city confidently. And while it can be scary and it seems like there's a lot going on, it's pretty simple once you know just like the base mechanics and like basically just how to navigate some of the like there are some confusing intersections in the city, and like coming up to those can always be a new challenge, but for the most part, once you have just those basic skills down, it becomes a lot less scary. And I think the confidence is also a big part of driving in the city, just you know, knowing that you're able to handle whatever situation you're going to be in.
Yeah, I agree. I think Hunter made a lot of good points. And I think like the first time I had to pass a bicyclist like along a road and there was 2 lanes, super skinny. It was pretty scary. And I like have to do that every time I drive to swim practice now. And so I think that, yeah, like he said, getting more practice, more exposure is super good. And seeing how your parents do what they do well in the city is important. But then I also think that it's important for kids to remember, like, just because you've done it a bunch of times doesn't mean you don't have to pay attention as much anymore. And like, sort of desensitizing yourself is good on one hand because you're more confident, but not as good on the other hand because you might not be paying attention to everything that's going on around you and you might miss something. So.
And those points that Hunter and Annika are making about practice and confidence and gaining those skills are really important ones to emphasize. Driving is probably one of the most complex tasks and the most dangerous tasks that we do as people kind of getting around. And that is one of the big reasons why graduated driver's license programs have been put into place across the country in most states. And Illinois has one example of a graduated driver's licensing process that these guys have gone through. And so with that, you've got some practice requirements when you're 15 and leading into getting your first opportunity to get your license at your 16th birthday. And that includes 50 hours behind the wheel, supervised with an adult who's at least 21, as well as 10 of those hours being at nighttime. And it's really important for drivers as they're learning to be exposed to different driving circumstances and weather conditions and road conditions so that they're getting a little bit of footing and practice in all of those different circumstances. We can never predict everything that's going to happen around us when we're driving, but the more practice we get under our belts with supervision and coaching from parents and instructors, the better prepared we are to be able to respond to those different situations.
Let's talk a little bit about those different situations. Annika, you kind of mentioned being desensitized a lot when you've been at something for, a while. I've been driving, oh gosh, for a little more than 20 years now, I think. I'm not good at math, but it's true. I think even just riding alone versus riding with somebody in your car, that changes the dynamics and your focus and what your perspective is on what's coming up. So how much does that affect someone's driving focus, Dr. Macy, when passengers and other, that's distraction too. It might not just be your phone, but the person sitting next to you.
Yeah, so that's one of the reasons why teen drivers have restrictions on the number of passengers they can have in a graduated license situation. And during those first couple years behind the wheel on your own in Illinois, you're limited to just one passenger. And then once you've got that time under your belt, then it expands to include additional passengers. But another important thing with the law is they emphasize wearing or only having enough passengers for whom you have seatbelts. And I think that drives home the point that seatbelts really save lives, but they only work if we use them. And so it's really one of the most effective public health strategies that we've had in the country, is to get seatbelts into all positions in a car. And wearing those seatbelts, wearing them properly, wearing them every time is an important thing for all of our teens to be doing. It's also important for our parents to be modeling for their teens and for their own safety.
And then talking about those agreements with family members or your parent or your guardian when you're learning to drive and getting your license, it's big independence. It's a milestone for a lot of young adults. So what kind of conversations should parents, guardians have with their young person about the responsibility?
So I'm going to turn that over to Annika first, then Hunter, then Jess, because I think that the real conversations that people have about that are a nice example of how it can play out. And families can turn to trusted resources like the Centers for Disease Control and the American Academy of Pediatrics for some example contracts. But those pieces of paper on their own aren't really what makes the magic of helping kids be safer behind the wheel. It's really those conversations. So Annika, could you start by talking a little bit about some of the conversations and expectations for having the privilege of being able to drive?
Yeah, I think overall, like the main message I feel like I've gotten from my mom and my dad is like to like be safe and like make safe decisions. And I think a good way to start out with that is, of course, following the law. But then building off of that, my parents and I have talked about making sure I don't ever put myself in a dangerous situation where I drive when I'm drunk or when someone else, one of my friends, is drunk and or like unable to drive in any way, too tired or anything. And we have made a plan that if I'm ever in a situation like that, I can text them, no questions asked, and like I know that they will be able to get me to a safe place. And I think having that trust with your kid that they will text you or call you if they're in an unsafe situation, and that you won't do anything as a parent to like punish them in that moment or make them feel like they should get in that car. So I think that's just something important that we've done.
I think Annika made a lot of good points, and me and my mom, we never had like a written agreement, but there, like, the number one thing that we would always stress is like, yeah, if anyone or if myself or anyone else is ever not able to drive for any reason, that I can always call her and she'll always come pick me up. And I'm not sure if it's so much no questions asked, but there's always like the true gravity of the situation was always like what was important. Like me getting in trouble, like I always knew that that was a little less important than like me dying or getting behind the wheel and having other people die because of that. Yeah, so I just think like the paper, the written contract could be very good, and it could give teens a little more say if you're negotiating this contract between you and your parents. But I think that just stressing the importance of like how dangerous being behind the wheel can actually be is just the number one thing. Yeah.
I think a lot of teens probably are apprehensive about calling their family or an adult to get them out of a situation. And so having that dialogue with somebody in your family who's looking out for your best interest, maybe you'll get grounded for a couple weeks or something, but at the end of the day, you get to still be grounded. So I think that's a really important message. And Dr. Macy, looking through some of these infographics from Safe Kids Worldwide, they state that the #1 killer of teens is motor vehicle crashes. So these conversations and that understanding of the responsibility that these teens are taking on it's really serious.
Yeah, and it's really, driving is a privilege. It's not a right. It's something that we all need to be taking seriously every single time we get behind the wheel. And, it's life or death consequences, and teens, while they're learning to drive and building up that skill set, are at the greatest risk for being involved in crashes and being in a fatal crash or causing a fatal crash. And so taking it easy, easing into it, making sure that we're not distracted by phones, by trying to eat or drink while riding the wheel, changing the radio, or even being in a busy environment where a distraction could come up unexpectedly. And that could be in a rural area, an animal crossing the road, and in a city, it could be a biker that comes up from behind, or a kid running after a toy or a ball that rolls into the street. So there's a lot going on with driving, and it's one of those situations where we really want teens to be taking it seriously and families to be having these conversations so that everybody's aware of the gravity of the situation and can be mobile while being safe. And I have always, liked hearing some of the ways that Jess articulates this. And so I'm wondering, one of the things that we talked about that I hadn't had a conversation with my kids about yet was some of the things around like what to do if you're ever involved in a crash. And I was wondering if you could speak to kind of that conversation that you've had with your family, Jess.
Thanks. I am a worst case scenario person, so I like to plan ahead for just in case if this ever happens. I think, we talk about this with like fire drills, with anything. If we plan for something, our brain is able to think through it, or not have to think through it as much and rely on instinct more when we actually do have that emergency that we've been planning for. So one thing that we have talked about is what to do in the event of different types of crashes. If you have a crash with another vehicle, or if you crash, for instance, like into a median or something, you have to take a look at your surroundings. Most of the time, it's safer to remain in the vehicle and, call 911. There could be all kinds of things going on. We've had drivers, crash into like power lines that could then be down. Getting out of the car could be an electrocution hazard. If you do exit the vehicle after you've had a crash, you are at an increased risk of getting hit by another driver. So, when other cars are coming up upon a crash, they can't always see what has happened. And especially if that other driver is texting or not paying attention in some way, you are much more likely to get injured or killed if you are outside of your car. So most of the time it's safest to remain in the vehicle with your seatbelt still on after a crash, unless there is some kind of hazard that you have to escape immediately. And it's really a case-by-case basis. The other thing we talked about a lot is, the worst case scenario. Let's say we hit a pedestrian or we hit a bicyclist. It is so easy to panic. It's especially easy for our teens to panic. And so what we have talked about is, no matter what happens, stop the car in a safe place, get out of the car and call 911 and render aid to that person, whatever you're able to do. Flag down a bystander, make sure that someone's calling 911 and someone is helping the person who has been hit, because those interventions in those first few seconds and minutes can save someone's life. And sometimes lives can't always be saved, but by stopping and doing the absolute best we can, we can ensure that we've done everything possible, both in the name of the law and also in being a good person. We want to stop and make sure that if someone's hurt, we help them. And again, remember to pull your car to like a safe spot where you can put it in park and not be causing another road hazard. So we want to make sure that we can help people and still be as safe as possible. So I know that's a worst case scenario that none of us want to think about, but I think having the what if in our brains and kind of practicing it in our minds helps us, that if we're ever in a terrible situation like that, that we know how to act and that we can act on instinct and remember to help someone if they're hurt.
And I think those kinds of things are great parts of the conversation with a family driving contract to have. And when teens are having conversations with their parents and their parents are talking to them about safe driving, I think it's a chance for there to be kind of a call out for accountability on both sides. And so both the parent and the teen agree that they're going to put the cell phone in the back seat or in the glove box, that they're not going to be answering the phone while they're driving. And that way there's kind of a recognition that both sides of the equation are contributing. Some of the things like Annika was saying are going to be legally restricted, but you might have a different curfew that you want to set in your own house. And if things go well as kids are learning to be safe behind the wheel, then that can get lightened up and loosened up and allow for a little bit more of that privilege to be exercised.
I think that's a really good point about just modeling behavior. You know, the adults are setting the example, and I am not at this point with my children yet. She's only 5, but she will tell me, you know, put your phone down or 2 hands on the wheel. So you have to be fully aware that you are being watched at all times, and you are setting that behavior, that modeling behavior. So that's a really good point. Well, let's see. I think we're almost at 30 minutes. Does anyone have some closing thoughts or points that they want to stress? I think one of the comments was, again, they really appreciated, Annika, when you said that parents letting teens know to contact them if they're in an unsafe situation, kind of no questions asked, and if they need a ride without negative repercussions is a great strategy. I think could prevent a lot of tragic events from happening. Just that understanding and that trust of an open dialogue is so important. And if we want to stress anything, I think that's a big one in my book.
Julianne, can I say something about that real quick?
Mm-hmm.
I love this. I think this is the best thing ever. And I want to remind, we've talked a lot about like, there are 2 sides to this contract. And I want to remind parents that it can be very challenging if your child calls you in the middle of the night and says, I need you to come pick me up, to not go there and scream and cry and say, what were you thinking? And so it's really important for us as parents to keep our side of that deal, because if we don't, there won't be a second time that our kids call us. And the whole no questions asked, no negative consequences, it is so important, because we want them, no matter how many times they get in this situation, we want them to know we care more about their lives than about, you know, choices that have been made before that. So you can make 1 bad choice, but don't make 2 by getting behind the wheel. I think it's really important that the parents keep our side of the bargain, and sometimes just zip it and pick them up and get them home safely. And hopefully that will build our teens' trust in us, that we can always be counted on for that, whether they're teens or not. You know, I want them calling if they're 50 years old and in this situation. So hopefully that trust, you know, is solidified by keeping our end of the bargain.
Could I add something to that real quick?
Please do.
So, like, I think that's awesome when parents can have that with their child, but I think, like, of course, there are some people, like I know some people who their relationship with their parents isn't as great, and the communication isn't as open as it is with, you know, me and my mom or other people and their parents. And so I think this comes from, sorry, I think this comes from, you know, my mom always stressing that she'll come pick me up whenever. But, you know, I've always advocated to my friends who I know don't have the same thing with their parents, that like if they ever need me to come, you know, pick them up and they don't want to tell their parents about it, like I'm that friend who will do that for people. And I think that, you know, like if you're a teen and you need that, I think just having a friend you can trust who is able to drive also is a good thing to have.
Those are great points. And one of the other things that I just wanted to throw into the conversation right now is like, drunk is way too far to be behind the wheel. Buzzed, feeling a little bit of an effect from alcohol, marijuana, over-the-counter medications that you're taking, prescription medications that you're taking, prescription medications that you took from a friend, are all things that can impair your reaction time. And if your reaction time is not where it should be, that's when you're in that situation where you're not able to respond to the environment around you and you're traveling fast. And those can be real serious conversations. Another one, as a shift worker, that I'm really aware of is driving sleepy. And if you're driving late at night, if you're driving after you haven't had a good night's rest, that's another thing that can be as bad as driving drunk or high. So really just being at your best level of alertness when you're driving is really important for all of us.
I think that's a great point to end on, unless you guys have any closing remarks, but this was great. Thank you guys so much for offering your different perspectives. It's truly helpful. And thank you all for joining us tonight. This video will be living on the Lurie Children's Facebook page, so you can reference it at any point. Thank you so much.